everyone, my name is Bailey Bryan, and for this video discussion, I chose a Daniel Dreisbach chapter from Reading with the Founding Fathers called The English Bible and American Public Culture. I found this chapter really interesting because it talked about how influential the Bible was on American culture and how it completely shaped every aspect, including language, literacy, legal culture, and constitutional tradition. I found this chapter really interesting because looking at the history of America, I think you can really see how influential Christianity and Protestantism and the Bible was on the people in America. And I think it's really ingrained in this religious culture is really ingrained in America. And looking at it, looking at New England and the Puritans who came here to have a religious haven where they could freely express their religion, and they wanted to be a city on the hill and be that example. And he says in this chapter that without a thorough knowledge of the Bible, one cannot understand Anglo-American history and culture. This is particularly true of the American experience. And that quote really stuck out to me because I think you can so clearly see the impact of the Bible on the colonial America and the Founding Fathers. And it was the most widely available book in the 17th and 18th century, so it makes sense that so many people had experience with it. Whether you were religious or not, it was so common in everyday life that it seems impossible to avoid. And he says that biblical language was so woven into the culture that you could see the language, themes, and rhythms in political discourse, judicial opinions, official proclamations, and even private correspondence that we can read. And this led to an interesting article by Aaron Shalev called Written in the Style of Antiquity. And in this article, he tells us that the language of the King James Bible was actually already outdated by 100 years when it was finished. The translators were keeping with Tyndale's original language, and so it sounded odd to even them. And so when people in the late 18th century opened their Bible, it was the language of the King James, and it so ingrained itself in the culture of America. And thinking about it in the context of the Revolution, I came across a book by Mark Knoll called In the Beginning Was the Word. And he makes a point that in this chapter on the rhetoric of the Revolution, that the Bible was so ingrained in the way people in the Revolution spoke and how it came out in the writings and the speeches and the politics of it. And he gives several examples, including John Adams criticizing the Stamp Act and making parallels with how Protestants talked about the Pope. He used phrases like man of sin and whore of Babylon. And another example was Benjamin Rush talking to Patrick Henry, where he says he felt the nation has come through the Red Sea. And these ideas were distinctly biblical, but they were not being used in a religious context. These were just everyday conversations or political discourse, but these men were using it in such a way that you can see the biblical reflection. It's really hard not to. It was so common that they didn't even think anything of it. It was just everyday speech patterns. And so many of them had lived through the Great Awakening. They lived through great orators like George Whitefield. And so you can see how important this reflection was. And so this type of rhetoric was just so common. Thomas Kidd, in his book, The Great Awakening, says that men like Patrick Henry were so successful because it was a mix of homespun style sprinkled with biblical references. He was able to use this biblical evangelical rhetoric that most, if not all, the people understood and were used to in everyday life. And I think this just shows how influential the Bible was on American culture. Many people like to think that the Founding Fathers weren't influenced by it, or that they were not Christian, or they had gone through the Enlightenment and they were past the need for the religious nature of these works, but they weren't. They had a profound effect on the Founding Fathers and the early people of America, and it shows up in revolutionary works all over. And I think it's just really incredible to see how impactful the Bible was on things that weren't even religious. So thank you.